Part 2. Travelers and Warriors. Chapter 14. What Torren Did. All day, after Caspar and Maddie left, Mrs. Murdo wondered where Lena was. Had the doctor sent her on an errand? She asked, but the answer was no. Did Torren know where she was? He said he didn't know, and he didn't care. Thinking maybe Lena had gone to the Pioneer Hotel to see Dune, Mrs. Murdo walked down there. But no one had seen her. By evening, when Lena was still missing, Mrs. Murdo was very worried. She found the note in her book that night. She frowned as she read it. This didn't seem like a good idea to her. It was one of Lena's rash, impulsive acts, and probably it was dangerous. Mrs. Murdo went downstairs, knocked on the doctor's door, and showed her the note. "Can we send someone after them?" she said, "to bring her back?" But the doctor shook her head. "They're a whole day ahead," she said. "No one could catch up, even if you could find someone willing to go." So Mrs. Murdo went back to bed and tried to sleep. She told herself that Lena had survived many dangers before, but still she lay awake worrying most of the night. In the morning, at breakfast, Torren asked where Lena was, and Mrs. Murdo told him. He jumped up from his chair. He threw down his piece of bread, which bounced on the table. "She went with them?" he cried. "She went with Caspar?" "Calm down," said Dr. Hester. "No!" yelled Torren. "I won't calm down! I hate her! I hate all you cave people! Why did you have to come here and ruin everything?" With a furious swipe of his hand, he knocked over Mrs. Murdo's cup of tea. He kicked backward at his chair, which fell over, and he ran out of the room. Through the window, Mrs. Murdo saw him racing across the courtyard and out the gate. "Jealous," said the doctor. "He wants Caspar all to himself. Heaven knows why." "That boy craves attention," said Mrs. Murdo. "I doubt that he cares who it comes from." "I suppose you're right," said the doctor, looking at Mrs. Murdo with faint surprise. Torren sped down the river road, full of boiling rage. He was the one who should be sitting beside Caspar, not that fat Maddie and not that stupid cave girl. He should be there riding on the truck, going away to be a roamer. But she had snuck off and done it instead, and he hated her for it. It was the worst thing that had happened to him in his whole life. He ran a long way, his feet pounding the dusty road, his fists pumping back and forth, furious tears streaming down his face. When he stopped, panting, he was way out in the tomato field, not far from the wind tower, where he had been the day the cave people came over the hill. He remembered how they had looked, like a swarm of horrible insects coming down toward the village. Now the cave people had settled in as if they were going to stay forever. They were eating food that should belong to Sparks people. They were wearing clothes that Sparks people had given them. They walked around in the streets of Sparks as if they belonged here. Torren wanted them gone. He stomped among the tomato plants, throwing punches at the air. "Get out of here! Get out!" he cried, as if Lena and all the Emberites were there to hear him. His thoughts were like flames inside his head. He kept seeing Caspar on the seat of his truck, with Maddie on one side of him and Lena on the other. The feeling that went with this picture was like a sharp stick in his stomach. If only he had one of those giant bombs they had in the old days. He imagined they were about the size of watermelons. He would shoot one at Lena. Pow! It would sail halfway to the city and drop right on Caspar's truck and blow them all up. Then he would shoot another one at the Pioneer Hotel. Blam! It would flatten the building and blow up every one of the cave people. He longed to throw that big bomb. He could almost feel it in his hands. He'd come out at the end of the row of plants now, where a small whitewashed storage shed stood at the edge of the field. Crates of tomatoes were stacked nearby, ready to be distributed. Without thinking, Torren grabbed a tomato from the nearest crate and hurled it against the wall of the shed. It splattered. Red water dripped down the white wall. It felt so good to do this that he did it again. In a fury, he snatched up one tomato after another. Wham! 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 He flung them with all his might, until the window of the shed splintered, the wall was a bleeding mess, and a long mound of broken red flesh lay on the ground. He stopped and took a breath. What would the farmers think when they saw this? 2 whole crates of tomatoes, smashed. They'd be angry. But they wouldn't know he had done it, would they? No one had seen him. And that was when an idea floated into Torren's mind. A really excellent idea. He smiled, thinking about it. He threw one last tomato, aiming for the dark, glass-toothed hole of the broken window. There was a satisfying crash as the tomato knocked something over inside. Torren turned and ran, but he didn't go all the way home. When Doone came through town that morning on the way to work, he found Mrs. Murdo waiting for him by the side of the road. She signaled to him with one finger, and he left the stream of workers and came over to her. "Lena has gone off," she said. "I thought you should know." "Gone off? Gone off where?" Mrs. Murdo produced a scrap of paper from the pocket of her skirt. "Read this," she said. Doone read. He scrunched up his nose in puzzlement. He remembered Lena telling him something the other day about these people, Caspar and Maddie. What had she said? He tried to recall. He looked again at the note. "Something important," she says. "What would that be?" Mrs. Murdo shrugged her thin shoulders. "She gets ideas in her head," she said. Doone could see that she was worried, though she didn't say so. "Well, she says she'll be back in 2 or 3 days," said Doone. "That's not so long." "The odd thing is," said Mrs. Murdo, "that Caspar, when he left, said he wouldn't be back for several months." Doone frowned. What was Lena up to? He didn't understand it, but he didn't want to make Mrs. Murdo more worried than she was. "She must have some plan for getting back," he said, handing back the note. "Of course," said Mrs. Murdo briskly. She folded the note and replaced it in her pocket. "There's no need to worry. I'll have her come and find you as soon as she returns." She headed back toward the doctor's house, and Doone went toward the fields. He walked slowly to give himself time to think. He was upset about Lena. How could she be so foolish as to launch herself out into an unknown world with 2 unknown people? But in a way he wasn't surprised. Lena was always eager to investigate new places. Look how she'd gone up to the roof of the gathering hall on the first day she became a messenger in Ember. Look how eager she'd been to go down into the pipeworks. She probably just wanted to see what was outside of Sparks. As soon as she'd satisfied her curiosity, she'd be back. But Doone was upset about Lena for another reason, too, and it didn't have to do with her safety. He was upset that she had gone exploring without him. All through the last days of Ember they'd been partners. Now she had gone off on her own, leaving him here. He was annoyed, and he was hurt. He had to admit to himself that he hadn't been a very good friend to Lena lately. Maybe he had hurt her feelings by paying so much attention to Tick. But still, it was Lena who was his partner in important things. If she had an urgent reason for hitching a ride with Caspar, why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she asked him to come along? He trudged toward the tomato field, head down, scuffing his shoes irritably in the dust. And so he didn't notice until he was right up to it that a commotion was going on by the storage shed. Everyone was crowded around it, and Chugger, the team leader, was yelling. Doone hurried forward to see what was going on. "Wasted! Wasted!" Chugger was shouting. 2 whole crates smashed! Who's done this? And the shed plastered with muck, and the window broken!" He glared at the crowd of workers. "Any of you know about this?" he demanded. "Anyone know what mad person did this?" No one said a word. Doone stared with horror at the mess on the wall. It looked gory, as if it were smashed animals instead of just tomatoes. He could feel the rage of the person who had done it. I don't like this, Chugger said darkly. Nothing like this ever happened before you people arrived. I want it cleaned up right away. Walls washed, window fixed, mess cleared away. Get on it. Listen, said someone. Dune turned to see. It was Tick speaking. We didn't do this. Don't get all tough with us. Chugger whipped around. Who else would do it? Who else but one of you, always griping and grumbling? But we only just got here now. How could we have done it? Someone called out. Besides, we wouldn't, cried someone else. We would never waste food. More and more voices rose in protest. Dune added his, too, saying, It wasn't us. It couldn't have been. But Chugger just stood and scowled at them. Finally, he yelled, Quiet! Get to work! Just after that, Dune heard running footsteps behind him and turned to see Torren racing across the field. He was shouting in his shrill, high voice as he came. I saw, he cried, waving his arms. Last night I was out here, and I saw... He ran into the midst of the workers and stood, panting, his little eyes wild. I heard a thump, 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 so I snuck up to see, and I did see. Well then, said Chugger, what did you see? I saw who threw the tomatoes. I saw who made that big mess and broke the window. He stood with his neck poked forward and his skinny arms held tight to his sides. His whole body was trembling with excitement. His eyes scanned the group of workers. It was him! He shrieked, pointing straight at Dune. It was him that did it. I saw him. Dune was so shocked that he couldn't make a sound. He stood with his mouth open, staring at Torren. Around him, a few people spoke up. He did not, said someone. He couldn't have. Anyway, he wouldn't. No, someone else said. He would never do that. But Chugger seized his arm and pulled him roughly aside. What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your doing? Dune shook his head. No, he said. No, that boy is lying. And why would he do that? Why would he take the trouble to come out here first thing in the morning and point to you and lie? I don't know, said Dune. Chugger released his arm with a push. I'll be keeping a special eye on you from now on, he said. But why? Said Dune. I didn't do this. How do I know that? Said Chugger. It's your word against his. And he's one of us.